1.8b, absolute value in equations and inequalities. Because the equation, the absolute value of x equals 3, means how many units the number is away from 3, or 3 units away from 1.8b, absolute value equations and inequalities. Because the equation, the absolute value equals 3, means all the numbers 3 units from 0, we can rewrite it as x minus 0 equals 3. Likewise, if we have the absolute value of x is less than 3, it means that all the points less than 3 units from 0. So we can rewrite it as the absolute value of x minus 0 is less than 3. Since the absolute value of x is greater than 3, identifies points more than 3 units from 0, we can rewrite it as the absolute value of x minus 0 is greater than 3. Example number 1 says, write an equation involving absolute value and solve. A company packages pasta in boxes and wants the boxes to be filled with 12 ounces of pasta. But the machine actually adds either 4 ounces too much or too little. Instead of fixing the machine, the company decides to sell the boxes that weigh 2 different amounts. What are the weights? So in the very beginning, it told us that it wanted us to write an equation. So that lets us know that we need an equal sign. It told us that it wanted the boxes to be filled with 12 ounces of pasta. So and then it told us that they are either 4 ounces too much or 4 ounces too little. So if we have the absolute value of p minus 12, we can set that equal to 4 because that represents 4 ounces too much or 4 ounces too little. When we solve an absolute value equation, we split our absolute value into 2 separate equations. Whatever's inside our absolute value bars always stays the same, so we have p minus 12 equals 4, and then we have p minus 12 equals negative 4 as our second equation. We then solve this just like we would a normal equation using inverse operations. So we get p could equal 16, and we could get p could equal 9. Excuse me, negative 4 plus 12 is 8, not 9. So our two options for the weight that they sell is we could have 16 ounces or 8 ounces. And it's very important that you label your answer to resemble what the problem was asking. Example number 2 says, write an equation involving absolute value and solve. A city located at a mile marker of 170 along an interstate has a 4th of July celebration. The city's firework display is visible from as far as 4 miles away. At which mile markers can drivers see the fireworks? So we have an absolute value, so we're having a fireworks show, and it's at 170 mile marker on the interstate. And it says that they can see them as far as 4 miles away. So we want less than or equal to 4 miles. We then are going to solve this absolute value inequality by splitting it into 2. So we have x minus 170 is less than or equal to 4. Then our second inequality is going to be x minus 170 is greater than or equal to negative 4. So when you flip over your inequality symbol for your second equation, you need to place a negative on that number. After you split it into your 2 inequalities, you want to solve just like we solved inequalities previously. So we use the inverse by adding 170, so we get x is less than or equal to 174. The inverse of negative 170 again is plus 170, and we get x is greater than or equal to 166. So when we write this as an inequality, we say 166 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 174. So on the highway, we can see the fireworks from mile marker 166 to 174. Example number 3 says, write an equation involving absolute value and solve. A company is making a glass window for an inspector. Rejects the glass if the thickness is more than 0.01 inches. So 1/100th, they reject the glass. From the intended thickness of 0.25 inches. For what thickness measurements will the inspector reject the glass? So when we write our absolute value, our original thickness is 0.25, so we write x minus 0.25 inside our absolute value, and we need it to be greater than 0.01. When we solve our inequality, we break our absolute value bars into 2, so we have x minus 0.25 is greater than 0.01. We have x minus 0.25. Notice what's inside the absolute value bars never changes. In your second inequality, you're going to flip your inequality symbol over and change the sign of that number. So when we use our inverse operations and add 0.25, we get x is greater than 0.26, or add 0.25, x is less than 0.24. We want to label both of those as inches, so we know that we are talking about the thickness of the glass. Example number 4 says, write an equation involving absolute value and solve. A certain freezer is supposed to maintain a temperature at negative 5 degrees Celsius, but the thermostat allows the temperature to fluctuate as much as 2 degrees Celsius. So in our absolute value equation, we want to subtract the initial temperature of our freezer, which is negative 5 degrees, and then it fluctuates, which we will put on the outside of our inequality, 2 degrees Celsius. What is the actual interval of the temperatures? To break absolute value bars, we split it into 2. 2 negatives right here change to a plus, so x plus 5 is less than or equal to 2. X plus 5, flip your inequality, change the sign on your number after that, negative 2. So then when we solve using inverse operations, we get x is less than or equal to negative 3. And we get x is greater than or equal to negative 7. So when we write this as an inequality, negative 7 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to negative 3. So our freezer temperature can fluctuate from negative 7 degrees Celsius to negative 3 degrees Celsius. Example number 5, write an equation involving absolute value and solve. A company fills bags of candy and then ships the bags in boxes of 10 bags each. The weight of the candy in each box is supposed to be 120 ounces and can vary no more than 5 ounces. What are the possible weights of one bag of candy? So the 5 ounces that our box can vary goes on the right-hand side of our inequality. inside our absolute value bars, we have 10 bags of candy weighing a certain amount minus 120 ounces. We then split our absolute value bars. 10x minus 120 is less than or equal to 5. That side doesn't change. 10x minus 120 is greater than or equal to, you noticed our inequality flipped over, change the sign on our 5, and then solve using inverse operations. So add 120, so 10x is less than or equal to 125, divide by 10, x is less than or equal to 12.5, add 120, 10x is greater than or equal to 115, divide by 10, x is greater than or equal to 11.5. When we write our inequality, we can write 11.5 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 12.5. You now can complete your worksheet.